I've worked on precision instruments my entire adult life. Calibration rigs, alignment tools, ceremonial-grade optical assemblies, field-rated adjustment systems for environments that don't forgive error. 20 years of this work across 14 postings, and what I can tell you after all of it is that a broken thing has a quality to it that is almost communicative. It sits in front of you and makes a kind of argument. It says, here is what I was, here is what I am. Here is the gap between those two conditions, and the gap wants closing. That's not philosophy. That's just what the work feels like from the inside. I've tried to explain it to people who don't do this kind of work and never quite managed. There's a rightness to a correctly functioning instrument that is recognizable in the same way a true note is recognizable, and there is a corresponding wrongness to something that is out of true, and you either feel that wrongness as a demand or you don't. I feel it as a demand. I have always felt it as a demand. It is one of the more inconvenient things about my character, and I've made my peace with it. The contract at Keth-Saroval Royal Transit Reception Station was a 6-week calibration and restoration posting. Standard Compact Field Services Agreement, mid-tier scope, issued through the Technical Auxiliary Division, because the station's in-house maintenance crew didn't have the certification for ceremonial-grade instrument work. I was the third technician they'd brought in over 2 years. The first 2 had completed their contracts without incident. I was not supposed to be different in any particular way. The station was larger than I'd expected. The transit reception function was the public-facing part, corridors and platforms and arrival halls in warm stone colors, all of it kept to a formality that I came to understand was not decorative but structural. Velthorin formal space had specific requirements. The proportions were deliberate. The lighting was calibrated. Even the temperature was held at a band I later learned corresponded to the physiological comfort range of the second house bloodline, which was the house in residence during the sovereign review period. The whole building was doing something, architecturally and environmentally, that I couldn't have articulated but that I felt as a kind of coherent intention. I was housed in the technical wing, 2 levels below the main ceremonial floors. My workspace was a long room with good bench lighting and a supply inventory that someone had kept carefully, which told me something about the station. The tools were organized by application and maintained to a standard I could respect. There were annotated calibration logs going back 11 years. Whoever had been doing the baseline maintenance here had been doing it correctly, and they had documented it correctly, and those 2 things together meant the foundation I was working from was solid. I spent the first day reading the logs and orienting to the equipment. The second day I started the calibration work, 14 optical alignment instruments in the diplomatic communication suite that had drifted beyond the acceptable band over the previous quarter. It was methodical work. I prefer methodical work. You move through it in order. You document what you find before you correct it. You verify the correction before you log it complete. The sequence is the same every time, and there is a comfort in that sameness that I have never been able to fully explain to people who don't do this kind of work. I was 3 instruments into the diplomatic suite sequence on the second day when I became aware I was being watched. I didn't look up immediately. When you're mid-calibration on a precision optical instrument, the head movement alone can introduce a drift in your reference line. I finished the adjustment I was on, locked the setting, verified the reading, then straightened and looked toward the doorway. A Velthorin child was standing at the threshold. She was small, the way Velthorin children are small, which is a particular quality of smallness. They carry themselves with a kind of deliberate stillness that makes them seem like they are saving their movements for something that will matter. She had ash-gray skin and amber eyes and dark hair cut short and practical. She was wearing a formal house coverall in the second house colors, dark blue with silver trim at the collar, and it fit her exactly, which meant someone had made it for her specifically, which meant she was not a passing child who had wandered into the technical wing by accident. She looked at me for a long moment. I looked back at her. Then she looked at the instrument I had been calibrating, with the specific focused attention of someone who wants to understand what they're seeing and is willing to take the time that requires. "Cale Wynn," I said. "Field Equipment Restoration. I'm on the calibration contract." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. She moved one step into the room, not toward me, just into the space, and continued watching. I went back to work. If the child wanted to watch, she could watch. I wasn't doing anything that required privacy, and there is nothing about calibration work that benefits from being conducted in a state of social anxiety about a 7-year-old standing in the doorway. The work is the work. It proceeds at the pace it needs to proceed, and it requires the attention it requires, and if someone wants to observe that, I have no objection. She stayed for 40 minutes, then she left without saying anything. She was back the next morning before I started work. She came in and sat on the low equipment shelf near the door, not on anything I was using, not in my workspace, just at the edge of the room where she could see everything clearly. I nodded at her. She inclined her head slightly, which I took for acknowledgement, and that was the full extent of our communication for most of the day. I ran the calibration sequence on instruments 4 through 7. The 4th was straightforward minor drift, corrected in 2 passes. The 5th had a more significant problem, a systematic error in the alignment plate that suggested it had been stored incorrectly at some point, and I spent the better part of an hour diagnosing it before I was satisfied I understood what I was looking at. The 6th and 7th were straightforward. I documented each one before moving to the next, and verified each documentation entry before closing the log. Around the middle of the afternoon, I needed to adjust my reference calibration rig, which required me to move it across the room. I picked it up. It's a medium-weight precision frame, awkward but manageable, and carried it to the secondary bench. "The left side mount is loose," the child said. I set the rig down and looked at the left side mount. There was a micro gap at the base fitting, barely visible, the kind of thing you'd catch on a proper inspection but might miss if you weren't looking for it specifically. I looked at her. "It shifts under load," she said. "I watched it shift when you picked it up." I checked the mount fitting. She was right. The thread had worn to the point where it was holding under static load but flexing under dynamic load, which meant any calibration I ran through that rig while carrying it would have introduced a small but consistent error into my reference line. An error I would not have caught immediately. An error that would have propagated through every reading I took until I noticed the output was off and traced it back to the mount, which might have taken the rest of the day. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once, with the gravity of someone receiving an acknowledgement that was due. I fixed the mount. She watched me fix it. I showed her what I was doing as I did it, not because she asked, but because someone who notices a micro gap in a reference mount fitting from across the room is someone who might find the repair technique interesting. She watched each step with careful attention and asked no questions, which is the mark of someone who is actually watching rather than preparing to ask questions. The repair took about 12 minutes. I replaced the worn thread insert, re-engaged the fitting to the correct torque, and ran a static load test to confirm the gap was closed. Then I picked up the rig, carried it across the room, set it down, and picked it up again, checking for flex at the mount. Nothing. Solid. "Better," she said. "Better," I said. She made a note. Then I went back to the calibration sequence, and she watched that too, and that was the rest of the afternoon. Her name was Sale. I learned this on the 3rd day, not from her but from the station's administrative coordinator, a Velthoran woman named Railvorn Dav, who came to check on my progress mid-morning and mentioned, in passing, that the child who had been sitting in the technical wing was the second daughter of the sovereign representative. I thought about this for a moment. Is she supposed to be here? I asked. Railvorn Dav made a small gesture that I had already learned to read as the Velthoran equivalent of a qualified yes. She is not prohibited, she said. The technical wing is not a restricted zone for house family. Whether she is supposed to be here, in the sense of whether anyone anticipated it, is a different question. Is it a problem? It is not a problem, she said, with the particular precision of someone choosing words very carefully. It is notable. I didn't know what to do with notable, so I thanked her for the information and went back to work. Sale arrived that afternoon with a small notebook. She sat on the shelf near the door and opened it and began making notes. I didn't ask what she was writing. Whatever it was her business. I ran the calibration sequence on instruments 8 through 11 and documented the results and started on 12. And Sale wrote in her notebook. And the afternoon was companionable in the way that afternoons in a quiet room with a methodical task can be companionable, without requiring anything from either party beyond the willingness to be present and to let the other person do what they are doing. On the third evening before she left, she did something I didn't expect. She turned to the page in her notebook she had been writing on most recently, looked at it for a moment, then looked at me. You check each measurement twice before you record it, she said. Yes, I said. Why twice? Because once tells you what the reading is, I said. Twice tells you whether the reading is consistent, and the reading only means something if it's consistent. She wrote this down, then she looked up. What if the second reading is different from the first? Then I take a third, I said, and I find out which two agree. She wrote this down as well, with the careful deliberation of someone who has received an answer they intend to use. And if all three are different? Then I stop and find out why before I take another reading, I said. Because the instrument is telling me something. It's either telling me the system is unstable, or my technique is inconsistent, or there's an environmental factor I haven't accounted for. Any of those is worth knowing before I continue. She was quiet for a moment, looking at what she had written. That's a lot of steps before you know anything, she said. Yes, I said, that's how you end up actually knowing it. She looked at me, and then at the calibration log open on the bench, and then back at me, and then she made one more note and put her notebook under her arm and left. On the fourth morning, she wasn't in the technical wing when I arrived. I ran through my morning setup, equipment checks, log review, planning the day's sequence, and she still hadn't appeared by the time I was ready to start. I assumed she had something else to be doing and didn't think much about it. I was 2 instruments into the day's sequence when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, and then she appeared in the doorway. She was not carrying her notebook. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something that was not quite urgency and not quite worry, but in the vicinity of both. Then she looked back toward the corridor. I waited. She looked at me again. Is something wrong? I said. She didn't answer directly. She took one step back into the corridor, the way a person does when they want you to follow them, and then she looked at me again. I put down the alignment tool I was holding, capped the instrument I was working on so it wouldn't collect dust, and followed her. She led me through the technical wing and up a half level to a section of the station I hadn't been in before, a quieter part of the building, with the particular stillness of rooms that are used for specific purposes and are empty between those uses. The lighting was different here, warmer, and the stone floors had a pattern inlaid in them that I recognized from the documentation I'd been given as ceremonial-grade installation. This area was part of the formal function of the station rather than its operational function. The corridors here were slightly wider. The proportions were different. Everything about the space communicated that it was intended for occasions. She stopped in front of a door, a heavy one with a pressure latch in the Velthoran style, and opened it. Inside was a room that I later learned was called a crown preparation anteroom. It was not large. There was a display case along one wall in a dark material I didn't recognize, and several stands of varying heights, and lighting positioned to illuminate whatever was placed on the stands from multiple angles. It was a room designed for one specific purpose: the preparation and display of ceremonial objects before formal occasions. Every surface, every fitting, every light source was oriented around that purpose. The room had been built to make one kind of object look correct. On the center stand at eye height was a crown. It was Veltharan ceremonial work, which I had never seen up close before. The construction was extraordinary layered metallic alloys in at least 4 different compositions, each one treated differently. The whole thing assembled with a precision that told you immediately that whoever had made it had understood that the object needed to last not just decades but generations. The craftsmanship was the kind that doesn't announce itself. It simply presents you with something that is exactly what it is, and makes you feel the wrongness of anything less. The outer structure was a series of tines, 12 of them, ascending in a specific geometric pattern that I recognized, even without knowing the cultural context, as meaningful in the way that proportions chosen carefully are always meaningful. One of the outer tines was bent. Not catastrophically, not broken, not cracked, not structurally compromised, but bent. 5, maybe 6 degrees out of true, at a point about 2/3 of the way up the tine where the alloy transitioned from the primary structural layer to the outer ornamental finish. The kind of damage that happens when something impacts at the wrong angle with insufficient force to break it but sufficient force to deform it. A corner of a case, maybe. A wrong placement during transport. Whatever had caused it, the result was one tine sitting at a slight angle that was wrong in a way that was immediately visible to anyone who understood what correct looked like. There was also a loose setting in the second ring from the base, left side, a small mounted element that had shifted out of its seat and was sitting at an angle that was functional but not right. I stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the crown on its stand. Sale was standing beside me. She was watching me look at it. I looked at the crown for a long time, then I looked at Sale. "Do you know if anyone is scheduled to work on this?" I said. She shook her head. "When is it needed?" She held up 3 fingers. 3 days. I looked back at the crown. The bent tine could be corrected carefully, with the right tools, using a technique for precision alloy work at transition points that I had used before on field instruments in similar alloy compositions. The loose setting was a reseating job, straightforward, assuming the mounting thread was intact. The whole repair, if I worked carefully, was 2 to 3 hours. I thought about this. The correct thing to do was report the damage to the administrative coordinator and let the station's chain of responsibility determine who was authorized to address it. I understood that. This was not my posting and not my contract scope. The crown was not an instrument I had been hired to touch. Reporting it was the procedurally correct action, and I knew that was the procedurally correct action. I also understood that in 3 days the crown was needed, that there was nobody currently assigned to repair the damage, and that the damage was repairable by someone with the tools and the technique and the training to do the work correctly. I went back to the technical wing and got my field restoration kit. When I came back, Sale was sitting on a low stool near the door of the anteroom. She had her notebook open. She was watching the doorway, and when I came through it with the kit, something in her expression settled in the way of someone who had been waiting to see what would happen and had received the answer they were hoping for. I set the kit on the floor and opened it and looked at the crown again for a moment, reading the object the way you read anything you're about to work on, the condition, the history of the damage, the structure underneath the surface presentation, the path from what it is now to what it should be. The first thing I did was nothing. I stood and looked at it for several minutes more, because with precision work the most expensive mistake you can make is to act before you understand, and understanding takes as long as it takes. You cannot hurry this part without paying for it later. Sale wrote in her notebook. When I was ready, I started with the loose setting. The mounting thread was intact. I checked it with a probe before touching anything else. The element had shifted because the securing fit had loosened over time, a common problem with objects that are moved and handled regularly. I reseated it with a setting tool from the kit, worked it back to the correct position in 2 careful passes, verified the alignment against the mirroring element on the right side, and checked the thread engagement with a measurement probe. Correct. Secure. I looked at the reseated element from 3 angles before I moved on. Sale watched me do this. I was aware, without looking at her, that she was tracking the sequence, the probe check before touching, the 2 passes, the verification against the mirror element, the 3-angle visual check. She had been watching me work for 3 days. She knew what checking twice looked like by now. The bent tine was more involved. The alloy transition point was the challenge, 2 different material compositions behaving differently under stress, which meant the correction technique had to account for both. I applied a stabilizing compound to the transition zone first, let it cure while I prepared the adjustment tool, then began the correction in very small increments, checking after each one. The metal had memory from the deformation event, which meant it wanted to return to the bent position rather than the correct one. You account for this by correcting past the target, knowing the material will spring back slightly, and you calibrate how far past the target you need to go based on your reading of the alloy's specific behavior under the technique you're using. This is not something you can look up. It is something you develop a feel for over years of working with similar materials in similar situations, and it requires your full attention. I had done this before, not on a crown, on precision optical components and field calibration frames and instrument housings, which are not crowns but which present similar problems in different contexts, and the technique is the technique regardless of what the object is. The object's significance doesn't change what it needs, it just changes what it costs if you get it wrong. I made 12 incremental corrections, checking after each one, recording each reading in my kit log. On the 12th, the tine was true. I held the probe at the transition point for a long moment before I accepted the reading. Then I verified it against the geometry of the adjacent tines, confirmed the visual alignment from 3 angles, ran a second probe measurement to confirm the first, and checked the surface finish for any deformation from the correction process. Clean. The alloy had taken the technique well. There was no visible evidence at the surface that the correction had been made, which is the result you want. The object looking the way it was always supposed to look rather than looking like something that had been repaired. I straightened up and looked at the crown on its stand. It was right now, in the way that a thing is right when it is what it is supposed to be. The tines were true. The settings were secure. The geometry was what the makers had intended. Whatever occasion required this crown, in 3 days, would find it ready. Sale had not said a single word during the 2 hours and 23 minutes I had been working. She had been sitting on her stool and writing in her notebook, and occasionally stopping writing to watch what I was doing, and then going back to writing. I was aware of her the whole time in the same way you're aware of a particular quality of light, not intrusively, just as a constant in the room. I repacked my kit, checked that I hadn't left anything on the surface or the floor, logged the completed repair with timestamps and technique notes, and looked at the crown one more time. Then I heard someone enter the anteroom behind me. I turned. The woman who had come through the door was tall, with the ash-gray skin and amber eyes of the second house bloodline, Sale's coloring but deeper, the tone of the senior generation. She was wearing formal house garments, dark blue with silver at the collar and cuffs, and she carried herself with the particular quality that I had learned in 14 postings across 11 species correlates with someone who exercises authority habitually, and has stopped performing it, because there is no longer any reason to perform what everyone already understands. She looked at me. She looked at the crown on its stand. She went completely still. Not startled, not alarmed, something more fundamental than either of those things. A stillness of someone for whom time has just restructured itself around a fact they were not prepared to encounter. I thought about what I should say. I had repaired an object that I had not been authorized to repair in a room I had not been authorized to enter, and the woman standing in the doorway was, based on the quality of her stillness and the way the house garments fit her, probably someone whose authority over that object and that room was considerably greater than mine. I noticed the crown had a damaged tine and a loose setting, I said. It's been repaired. The tine was corrected at the transition point. The alloy took the technique cleanly, no surface damage, it's true. The setting was reseated and thread engaged. Both repairs are documented in my kit log, if you want a record. She did not respond. She was still looking at the crown. I looked at Sale. Sale was looking at her mother. The silence continued for long enough that I started to genuinely reassess the situation, and found it less comfortable on reflection than it had seemed while I was working. The crown was a ceremonial object in a space I had entered without clearance, and I had laid hands on it without authorization, and the woman in the doorway was not speaking, and the quality of her stillness was doing something I couldn't read. I can walk you through the repair technique, I said, if there are questions about what was done. How? The Queen said. It was one word and it stopped me. I'm sorry. She looked at me then. Not at the crown, at me. How did you touch it? She said. Her voice was level, precisely level the way a voice is when the person speaking it is maintaining the level by attention. Your hands. How did you touch it? I thought about this question carefully. With field restoration tools, primarily. For the tine correction, I used a stabilizing compound and incremental adjustment with a calibration grade correction tool, precision tip, low force technique. For the setting reseat, I used a standard setting tool and a probe. My hands contacted the crown directly for the initial assessment, to read the damage, and at several points during the tine correction, where I needed to stabilize the structure against the adjustment force. I kept direct contact minimal because the alloy work requires steady force management and tool-mediated force is more controlled. Every contact point is logged. She was very quiet. The repairs are correct, I said. I wouldn't have stopped if they weren't. I know, she said. I can see that they are. Another silence. Then Sale, from her stool near the door, said something in Velthoran. I don't speak Velthoran beyond the practical phrases needed for a field posting, but I recognized the register immediately. It was the formal register, not the register children use with adults, but the register used between adults of equivalent standing when something is being stated for the record. A 7-year-old using the formal register was not something I had encountered before. It had the quality of something prepared, something decided. The Queen's expression shifted, not much, but something happened in it that hadn't been there before. She looked at her daughter. Sale met her mother's eyes and said something else, shorter, in the same register. Then the Queen looked at me again. My daughter says, she began, and then paused, and the pause was doing something I couldn't read. She says that she watched you work for the full duration. She was very quiet about it, I said. I didn't mind. She says you handled it the way you handle everything in the technical wing, the Queen continued. She says you looked at it for a long time first. She says you checked every repair before you moved to the next one. She says you documented each step, even though no one was there to require it of you. That's the process, I said. That's just what the work requires. Yes, the Queen said. Something in the room had changed. I couldn't identify the quality of the change precisely, only that it was present and significant, and that it seemed to involve the crown on its stand and my hands and the Queen standing in the doorway and the specific way she was holding herself, as if braced for something she had not anticipated needing to brace for. I decided that honesty was the appropriate instrument here. I should have reported the damage through proper channels before attempting the repair, I said. I understand that. I made a judgment call based on the timeline and the scope of what needed doing, and I would understand if that creates a problem. It is not a problem, she said. Okay. It is, she said, a significant complication. I waited. She looked at the crown one more time, and the look had a quality to it that I can only describe as weighted, as if she were looking at something that had acquired a meaning it had not previously held, and she was deciding what to do with the new meaning. Then she said, quietly, almost to herself rather than to me, in a voice that was still precisely controlled but containing something it was working to contain, "Only my mate can touch this." I heard the words. I understood each one individually. The sentence assembled itself in my comprehension, and I sat with it for a moment to be sure I was understanding what I thought I was understanding. "I'm sorry," I said. "Is that a protocol I was unaware of, a restriction specific to the crown?" She looked at me. "Yes," she said. "It is a Velthoran crown touch protocol. The sovereign's ceremonial crown may be handled without ceremony only by the sovereign's bonded mate. By any other party, the handling of the crown requires a formal transfer of custody with witnesses and the sovereign's explicit designation, conducted in advance." I turned this over. "So when I—" "Yes." "And that means—" "Yes." I looked at the crown on its stand. I looked at my hands. I looked at the queen in the doorway. "I didn't know," I said. "I understand that," she said. "The crown had a bent tine," I said, which I was aware was not the most useful contribution at that moment, but it was the most accurate one, and I had nothing more sophisticated to offer. "I know," she said, and then, very quietly, "I have known about the tine for some time. I was waiting for the appropriate moment to address it through the correct channels." Something in her voice when she said this was not quite what I expected from a sovereign discussing a damaged ceremonial object. It had a quality closer to what I have heard in the voices of people who have been managing a difficult thing with patience and have now encountered an unexpected development, and are in the early stages of determining whether the unexpected development is catastrophic or something else entirely. "I've caused a diplomatic issue," I said. "You have created," she said carefully, "a situation without an immediate category in Velthoran protocol. Is there a way to address it correctly?" She looked at her daughter again. Sale was still sitting on her stool, watching both of us with the focused, careful attention of someone who understands that what they are witnessing is important and intends to witness it accurately. "There are several ways," the Queen said. "The protocol exists within a body of law. That body of law has provisions. The provisions are not," she paused. "They are not uncomfortable provisions." I waited. Waiting felt like the appropriate contribution I could make to the situation at that moment. "The Crown Touch Protocol," she said, "was established to protect the sovereign's bond from exploitation. The historical reasoning is that the sovereign's bonded mate is a person who touches what the sovereign wears with care and attention, in the way of someone who has a permanent stake in the sovereign's well-being. The protocol assigns that significance to the act itself, rather than to the stated relationship, because the law's authors understood that the act and the relationship are not always aligned, and that the act is the better indicator." I listened to this carefully. "So the question the law asks," I said slowly, "is not who touched it but how." She held my gaze. "Yes," she said, "how and for what reason and with what degree of care." I thought about the 2 hours and 23 minutes I had spent in this room, the time I had taken before touching anything, the way I had read the damage, the stabilizing compound and the 12 incremental corrections and the check after each one, the probe verification before and after, the kit log with timestamps. The way I had looked at the completed repair from 3 angles before putting my tools away. I looked at it for a long time before I touched it, I said. My daughter told me, the Queen said. Sale from her stool said something else in the formal register, brief, direct. The Queen translated without looking away from me. She says you checked everything twice. She says you documented each step in your kit log without being asked. She says you looked at it after you were done the same way you looked at it before you started, which is how you confirm that the result is what it was supposed to be and not merely what you wanted. I had done all of those things. They were the process. The process was the same regardless of what the object was. She has been watching you work for 3 days, the Queen said. She has been deciding whether what she was watching was consistent, whether what you did in the technical wing was who you are or only what you do when someone might check your work. I thought about this. No one was checking my work, I said. The contract documentation is filed at completion. The only person in the room most of the time was a 7-year-old with a notebook. Yes, the Queen said. That was the point of the 3 days. I looked at Sale. I hope it was accurate, I said. It was, Sale said. She said it in compact standard. The first time in 3 days she had spoken to me in compact standard, and she said it in the formal register, in the tone that a person uses when they are stating something they have verified and found correct. Not reassurance, a conclusion. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the amber eyes that were her mother's eyes and the composed, deliberate expression of a child who has spent 3 days building an assessment and has now delivered its findings. The Queen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The provisions I mentioned, they require a formal conversation with the compact administrative coordinator present to establish the protocol status correctly and to determine which provision applies." She paused. "I would like to have that conversation." "All right," I said. "It will require your willingness to consider a significant change to your situation here." "Okay," I said. She looked at me with the expression of someone who is uncertain whether the person they are speaking to has understood the full scope of what they have just agreed to consider. I hadn't fully. I want to be honest about that. I understood that there was a protocol issue and that it needed to be addressed through a formal process, and I was prepared to participate in that process, because there was no world in which I was going to walk out of a room and leave a significant complication unaddressed when I had caused it by fixing a bent tine, without first checking whether the object I was fixing had attached cultural weight I wasn't aware of. That much was straightforward. The rest of it I was still working out. The formal conversation with the administrative coordinator took place the following morning. Railvorn Dav was present, and a compact liaison officer who had come in on the morning transit connection, and the Queen and Sale, who sat in a chair beside her mother, and listened to the entire proceeding with the focused attention of someone who had decided in advance that this was an important record to keep, and intended to keep it with full accuracy. Her notebook was open from the beginning. I sat across the table from the Queen, and listened to an explanation of the full scope of the Crown Touch Protocol and its provisions, including the provisions for situations arising from the protocol being engaged without the engaging party's knowledge or deliberate intent, which apparently existed in considerable detail, and were apparently more accommodating than I would have expected from a protocol of this significance. Velthoran law, I was learning, had been built over a very long time by people who understood that situations arise that no one anticipated, and that the provisions governing those situations should reflect the quality of what happened rather than only its technical category. The founders of the protocol had apparently been practical people who understood the difference between form and substance, which I found myself respecting. What the law required in this situation was a formal assessment of the act and its context, the conditions under which the crown was touched, the manner of the touching, the documented evidence of care applied, and the circumstances that produced it, and a determination by the sovereign as to which provision applied. The determination took the form of a question. Railvorn Dav addressed it to me, reading from the protocol text. Given the circumstances as described and assessed, was I willing to have the act interpreted under the provisions for bond-adjacent handling, understanding that those provisions carried implications for my status relative to the sovereign and the second house going forward? I said I needed to understand what bond-adjacent handling meant before I answered. Railvorn Dav explained it. I listened carefully. She explained it in full, with specific reference to the relevant articles and their practical implications, in the methodical way of someone who had read the complete text and understood it. The compact liaison officer looked somewhat stunned by the time she finished. Sale was writing in her notebook. I looked at the Queen across the table when Railvorn Dav was done. The Queen met my eyes. Her expression was composed, as it always was, but there was something underneath the composure that I had not seen before, a quality of waiting that was more personal than official. The kind of waiting that has a stake in the outcome. I would like to understand, I said, how the sovereign feels about the provisions, before I answer the question. Railvorn Dav paused and looked at the Queen. The Queen was quiet for a moment. The sovereign, she said, with a precision that was almost dry, has been informed by her daughter for 3 days about the manner in which a compact field technician handles broken things. She has reviewed the kit log. She has seen the tine herself. A pause. She finds the provisions not unreasonable. Okay, I said. I sat with this for a moment and thought about it properly. The crown had been bent. The setting had been loose. I had fixed both because that is what I do with things that are fixable, and the fixing had been done carefully because careful is the only register I have for work that matters, and the work had mattered in ways I had not known about at the time and could not have anticipated. I thought about Sale sitting on her stool for 3 days with her notebook, checking whether what she was watching in the technical wing was who I was or only what I did when there might be consequences. I thought about 12 incremental corrections and a probe check after each one. I thought about the crown sitting true on its stand, ready for whatever occasion needed it. Yes, I said. Railvorn Dav looked at me with the careful attention of someone who wants to be certain they have received the right answer. You're answering the formal question, in the affirmative. Yes, I said, I'm answering the formal question in the affirmative. The compact liaison officer made a notation with the expression of someone who is going to need some time to draft his report. Railvorn Dav made her notation with the efficiency of someone who had understood this conclusion as possible from the beginning of the proceeding and had prepared for it accordingly. Sale made her notation in her notebook, with the expression of someone recording a conclusion she had assessed as likely but had waited to confirm. The Queen looked at me for a long moment. Then she inclined her head, deliberately, in the formal Velthorin gesture that I had learned was not a small thing to give or to receive. The formal conversation concluded. The documentation was filed. The compact liaison officer took his leave with an expression suggesting his report was going to require several drafts. Railvorn Dav gathered the formal record and left with the specific efficiency of someone who has a great deal of administrative work to organize and intends to do it correctly. Sale and the Queen and I were alone in the room. Sale closed her notebook. She had not closed it once during the entire proceeding. She has been asking me, the Queen said, for 3 days whether the compact technician was careful enough. I looked at Sale. What did you decide? I said. She considered this with the same careful deliberation she brought to everything. The deliberation was not for show. She was actually thinking. You checked every repair before you moved to the next one, she said. You looked at the time for a long time before you touched it. You documented everything in the kit log even though no one was present to require it of you. And you looked at it when it was finished the same way you looked at it before you started, which is how you know the difference between the result you achieved and what you were hoping for. Those are not the same thing. Knowing the difference matters. I sat with this. That's the process, I said. Yes, she said, that's why. I finished the calibration contract. The remaining 2 weeks of the posting proceeded in the ordinary way: instrument work, documentation, methodical progress through the sequence, with the addition that Sale came to the technical wing every afternoon and sat on the shelf near the door, and on the final 3 afternoons the Queen came and took the other chair, the one I didn't use, and sat and watched me work. Neither of them spoke much during the working hours. They understood that the work required its own kind of attention, and that being present for it was different from interrupting it. On the last afternoon, after I had packed the calibration kit and made the final log entry, and confirmed that everything was in order, I went to the crown preparation anteroom one more time. The crown was on its center stand. The time was true. The setting was secure. The room was doing what it was designed to do, which was to present the object correctly and let it be exactly what it was. I looked at it for a moment, the way I always look at completed work. Then I left it where it was. Some things don't need anything else done to them. When the work is right, the right thing is to put your tools away. I've been at Keth Saruval for 4 years now. The scope of my posting has changed, and the designation in the station's administrative record has changed, and the shape of the days looks considerably different from the 6-week calibration contract I arrived on. The technical wing is still my domain. The calibration logs are still annotated in my handwriting. Some things don't need to change. Sale is in the compact administrative law program she has been planning since she was 7 years old. She sends me her coursework sometimes, the sections where she has identified cross-referencing errors or procedural gaps, because she knows I will read them completely and tell her whether the findings hold. I read them the same way I read everything, past the summary, to the end, checking each step before accepting the conclusion. They usually hold. She is rigorous in a way that suggests she has always been rigorous and will be rigorous for the rest of her life, which I find a deeply reassuring quality in a person who intends to work in administrative law. The Queen still walks the ceremonial corridor every morning at the 6th hour. I know the sound of it by now, the particular cadence, the pause at the north window, 4 years of the same pace at the same hour. I have come to understand this as a kind of consistency, which is something I value for the same reason I value calibration logs. You know where you are when the measurements are reliable. The crown is used several times a year for formal occasions. On those mornings, I go to the preparation anteroom before the first hour and look at the time, the same way I always look at completed work, checking it with the same attention I gave it on the first day, not because I expect it to have failed, but because that is the only way to know the difference between something that is holding and something that is going to hold. The check and the object are the same. The habit doesn't change with the occasion. It's still true. It stays true. That's all the work ever asked.